There is a sealed chamber in the Mogao Caves in the desert west of Dunhuang, in the Chinese province of Gansu. Scholars call it Cave 17. For roughly 900 years it held a library. The library was bricked shut sometime around the year 1002 and forgotten. In 1900, a Taoist caretaker named Wang Yuanlu broke through the wall and found tens of thousands of manuscripts stacked inside. They were written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Uyghur, and Khotanese. The Tibetan manuscripts contained material that did not match the official Buddhist history of Tibet. Some described a pre-Buddhist religion called Bon, a lost kingdom called Zhang Zhung, and a line of kings said to have descended from the sky on a cord. Within some 7 years, the Hungarian-British archaeologist Aurel Stein had carried tens of thousands of these documents out of China. Most are now in the British Library in London and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. It is called the Dunhuang Library Cave, and what happened when a small number of scholars decided to take its Tibetan contents seriously, not as mythology, not as shamanic metaphor, but as what they appear to be, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed stories in the history of ancient studies. Mogao Caves are a complex of nearly 500 Buddhist grottos carved into a cliff face along the southern edge of the Gobi Desert. They were active as a religious and trading centre from the 4th century onward, when the Silk Road carried goods and texts between China, Central Asia, and India. Cave 17 itself is small, only a side chamber off a larger cave, perhaps 3 metres across, sealed with a plastered wall painted over with frescoes so it would look like ordinary rock. Behind that wall, sometime near the year 1000, monks deposited an estimated 50,000 manuscripts and printed documents. The most recent dated text in the cache is from approximately the year 1002. Some of the manuscripts inside are much older. Tibetan language texts include items written during Tibetan occupation of Dunhuang, which lasted from approximately 786 to 848 CE, and which preserved versions of the older Bon religion that the later Buddhist Tibetan establishment worked to suppress or absorb. These are not retellings filtered through 1,000 years of orthodox commentary. They are pre-orthodoxy. They describe a cosmology in which the first rulers of Tibet were not human in the usual sense. They came down from a place called the realm of the Lie, on a thread or cord referred to as the Mu, and they returned along it when their reigns ended. The thesis of this video is simple. The Dunhuang Tibetan manuscripts contain a coherent and specific account of non-human beings descending to govern a particular region of Asia, with a particular method of descent in a particular era, and that account has not been refuted. It has been characterized. It has been categorized. It has not been refuted. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts, like the Dunhuang manuscripts, has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in museum reading rooms waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. Conventional academic reading of the Dunhuang Tibetan manuscripts treats them as an invaluable but ordinary historical resource. Mainstream Tibetologists, including Sam van Schaik of the British Library and Rolf Stein of the Collège de France, have spent decades cataloguing the collection and translating its contents. Their work is meticulous and largely correct on its own terms. The orthodox view runs like this. The manuscripts date from approximately the 8th century CE through the early 11th century CE. They were sealed sometime around the year 1002, possibly to protect them from an approaching threat, or possibly as a ritual deposit of damaged or superseded texts. Tibetan language items reflect the religious situation of Tibet during and just after its imperial period, when Buddhism was being grafted onto a deep and resistant native tradition called Bon. The accounts of kings descending from the sky on cords are read in this conventional framing as origin myths typical of Central Asian sacred kingship. The king's body imagined as a vertical link between heaven and earth, the rope a metaphor for legitimacy rather than a method of transport. The first king, Nyatri Tsenpo, is treated as a semi-legendary figure whose reign, if it occurred, is conventionally placed around 127 BCE. The kingdom of Zhang Zhung, from which Bon is said to derive, is treated as a real but archaeologically obscure polity in western Tibet, perhaps centred on the area around Mount Kailash. Cosmological details. The realm of the La, the descent on the Mu cord, the seven heavenly kings, are read as religious symbolism, not as history. This is the conventional reading. It is fair, it is careful, and within its own assumptions, it is internally consistent. The question is whether its assumptions are the only ones the manuscripts permit. Break in the conventional reading begins with the Italian Tibetologist Giuseppe Tucci, who led 8 expeditions to Tibet between 1928 and 1948. Tucci was not a fringe figure. He held the chair of religions and philosophies of India and the Far East at the University of Rome. He read classical Tibetan, Sanskrit, Chinese and Persian. He founded the Italian Institute for the Middle and Far East, and in the course of his expeditions, he collected, photographed and described texts and oral traditions from Western Tibet that did not fit the standard Buddhist history. Tucci's published work, including the multi-volume Tibetan painted scrolls, noted repeatedly that the Bon material treated the descent of the early kings as a literal event. The texts described a specific lineage: 7 kings of the sky, 2 kings of the upper realm, 6 earthbound kings, 8 middle kings. The lineage was not symbolic, it was genealogical. Each king was named, each reign was sequenced, and each descent and return was described with the same physical detail one finds in a Sumerian king list. This pattern was carried further by the Tibetan scholar Namkhai Norbu, who held the chair of Tibetan and Mongolian studies at the University of Naples Oriental Institute from 1964 until his retirement. Norbu was himself a Dzogchen master in the Bon-derived tradition, and he had access to texts and oral commentaries that Western scholars did not. His book Drung, Diu and Bon, published in 1995, gathered together the surviving accounts of the pre-Buddhist royal lineage, and showed that the descent narratives in the Dunhuang manuscript agreed in specific detail with later Bon texts that had survived in monasteries in eastern Tibet and in exile communities in India. The methodology in both cases was unglamorous. Tucci and Norbu read the texts. They compared them across regions and centuries. They tracked which details were stable and which had been added or smoothed by later editors. And what they found was that the most archaic stratum, the layer closest to the original Bon material, was the most physical, the most specific, and the least metaphorical. The later the text, the more the descent became poetic. The earlier the text, the more it sounded like a record. Dunhuang manuscripts, sealed before the great Buddhist editing of Tibetan religious memory was complete, preserved the early stratum. Tucci and Norbu are not fringe figures. Tucci was awarded the Jawaharlal Nehru Award for International Understanding. Norbu was a recognised lineage holder in the Bon tradition and a tenured professor at an Italian state university. Their reading of the descent narratives as something more than symbolism has never been formally refuted. It has been ignored, or quietly set aside, by a generation of Tibetologists who prefer the metaphorical reading. No competing analysis has been published that, accounts for the consistent physical specificity across the archaic stratum. The early Bon stratum is read as a record rather than a metaphor. Several things follow at once. First is geographical. The descent narratives place the origin of the first king at a specific mountain, Mount Lari Gyangto, identified by tradition with a peak in the Yarlung Valley of central Tibet, and the realm of the La is located, in some texts, above the western mountain known to the Bon tradition as Zhang Zhung Gutsek, the 9-story swastika mountain, often identified with Mount Kailash in far western Tibet. Mount Kailash is 6,638 meters tall. It is sacred to 4 religions, Bon, Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism, and no one has ever climbed it. Pilgrims still circumambulate its base on a route 52 kilometers long. Bon texts describe Kailash as the physical anchor point of the cord by which the first kings descended. This is the second thing that follows. The descent is not described as an abstract emanation. It is described as a journey along a thread or cable that connected 2 specific places, the realm of the Laa above and the summit or the slope of a particular mountain below. The cord is called the Mu, and in the most archaic versions of the story, the king was attached to it from the crown of his head. While the cord was intact, the king could return to the upper realm at will. When the cord was severed, by accident, by violence, or by the king's own choice, the king became permanently mortal. His body remained on earth at death, and the lineage of descent was broken. The 7th king, whose name was Drigam Tsenpo, is said to have been the one who severed his own cord through pride during a ritual combat. From that point onward, the kings of Tibet were buried in tombs in the ground, rather than vanishing back into the sky. The royal tombs of the Yarlung kings are a real archaeological site. They lie in the Chongye Valley south of Lhasa, and they were studied in detail by the Chinese archaeologist Su Bai in the 1960s and again in the 1980s. Tombs are large earthen mounds. The earliest of them are conventionally dated to the 7th century CE. But Bon tradition holds that the practice of burial began precisely with Drigam Tsenpo. That is, with the first king whose cord was broken. Before him, no tombs, because the kings did not stay. After him, tombs, because they did. This is a falsifiable pattern. If you want to check this, the Chinese archaeological reports on the Chongye tombs are published. Third implication is chronological. The 7 sky kings are placed by Bon chronology before the historically dated kings of the imperial period. Different Bon lineages give different absolute dates, but the consensus places the descent of the first king somewhere between the 3rd century BCE and the early 1st century BCE, a window of roughly 200 or 300 years. This is the same general window in which the Sumerian king list recorded on the Weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford closes its own list of descending kings, though the Sumerian list is much earlier and much longer. The Weld Blundell prism lists 8 antediluvian kings reigning for a combined 241,200 years before the flood. After the flood, the reign lengths drop sharply, then stabilize at human proportions. The Tibetan pattern is shorter and tighter, but the structure is the same. Finite line of supernatural kings, a break, then ordinary human rule, independent attestation, of the same structure across cultures separated by thousands of kilometers, and by writing systems that share no common ancestor, is not, by itself, proof of a common historical event, but it is the kind of pattern that is supposed to be explained, rather than waved away. The 4th implication is methodological. If the Dunhuang Tibetan manuscripts preserve an archaic stratum that other Tibetan texts have lost, then the comparative method must begin with them, not with the later Buddhist chronicles, standard reference work for early Tibetan history. The old Tibetan annals also from the Dunhuang collection, is conventionally treated as the primary source for the imperial period beginning in the 7th century CE. But the same Dunhuang collection contains material that points further back to a kingdom called Zhang Zhung, which the annals barely mention. Zhang Zhung is, in the conventional reading, a small obscure polity. In the Bon reading, it is the source civilization from which Tibetan religion and kingship descended, and its capital, called Kyunglung Gulkar. The silver castle of the Garuda Valley is identified with a ruined site in the upper Sutlej Valley of western Tibet that Chinese archaeologists have begun to survey only in the last 20 years. Fifth implication is what the Tibetan tradition itself preserved about the inhabitants of the upper realm. They were not called gods in the abstract sense, called La, and they were described as a class of beings with specific bodies, specific clothing, specific languages, and specific tools. They were said to teach. They taught metallurgy, astronomy, and a script, a writing system referred to in Bon texts as the script of the Smar, which is claimed to predate the Tibetan alphabet introduced in the 7th century CE under King Songtsen Gampo. Specimens of this older script appear on rock inscriptions in western Tibet that remain undeciphered. They are not symbols, they are letters. They are arranged in lines, they have a syntax, and no one has read them. The academic response to the Tui and Norbu readings has been in the most accurate description, characterization rather than engagement. The descent narratives are routinely described as shamanic, as axial symbolism, as central Asian sacred kingship motifs. None of these characterizations is wrong as a category. None of them addresses the specific question: why the archaic stratum of the texts contains physical detail that the later stratum does not. If the descent is purely symbolic, the symbolism should be most elaborate in the most literary and most theologically developed texts. Pattern in the Dunhuang material is the opposite. The earliest layer is the most physical. The later the editor, the more the chord becomes a metaphor, and the more the la become abstractions. This is not the signature of a religious symbol that started concrete and was over-explained. It is the signature of a memory of something concrete that was gradually theologized into symbol by later editors who no longer understood or no longer accepted the original refutation of the Tui and Norbu reading would require engaging with this specific pattern. It would require showing that the archaic stratum is, in fact, more metaphorical than the later stratum, or that the apparent physical specificity is an artifact of translation, or that the pattern arose through some other mechanism. None of these refutations has been published. The form of dismissal has instead been silence. Tucci's later writings on the subject are cited for their philological detail and quietly set aside for their interpretive conclusions. Norbu's Drung, Diu, and Bon is in print and available, and is rarely cited by Tibetologists outside of the specialty subfield of Bon studies. No counter-volume has been written. No peer-reviewed article has appeared in the last 20 years, specifically refuting the claim that the archaic stratum of the descent narratives is physically descriptive rather than metaphorical. Pattern is consistent with the broader academic response to alternative readings of ancient cosmological texts. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. The characterization in this case is the word shamanic, used as if it were a complete explanation. It is not. Shamanism is a category that contains many specific practices and many specific cosmologies. And the question is which specific cosmology the Dunhuang texts describe, and whether that cosmology is internally coherent and externally corroborated. Tui and Norbu argued that it is both. The mainstream response has been to treat their argument as if it had already been answered, when, in fact, it has not been answered at all. There is a structural reason for this, which the audience should hear stated plainly. Tibetology as a discipline is small, p. The number of scholars worldwide, with the language competence to read classical Tibetan, Old Tibetan, and the Zhang Zhung fragments is perhaps in the low hundreds. Those most depend for their careers on access to monasteries, manuscripts, and government permissions in China and India, publishing a paper that takes the literal reading of the descent narrative seriously is not a career-neutral act. It is a career-negative act. So the question goes unasked, not because it has been answered, but because asking it has become professionally unprofitable. The Avi Loeb case at Harvard is a useful parallel. Loeb is the former chair of the Department of Astronomy at Harvard University, and his proposal that the interstellar object known as Oumuamua might be of artificial origin was not refuted on its specific evidentiary points. It was characterized as unprofessional and dismissed in venues that did not engage with his actual calculations. The same dynamic operates in Tibetology, with less media attention and far fewer outside observers. The question of what the early Bonn texts actually describe is still open. The texts are still in the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. They are available to any researcher who wants to check them. Academic response, after 126 years, has been essentially silence, followed by dismissal. To understand what the Dunhuang Tibetan manuscripts describe, one has to understand the world they came out of, and the world that world remembered. The Tibetan plateau is the highest sustained inhabited land on Earth. Its average elevation is approximately 4,500 meters. The air is thin, the light is harsh, the horizon, on a clear day, is visible at distances that on lower ground would be impossible. The sky is, from the plateau, closer than it is from almost anywhere else humans live. When the first observers of the night sky on the plateau looked up, they saw stars that observers in the valleys of the Indus and the Tigris and the Nile did not see. Fainter stars, more of them, with less atmosphere in the way. Cosmology of Bonn reflects this physical fact. Heaven, in Bonn, is not a distant abstraction. It is the visible upper world, immediately overhead, separated from the earth by a thin and crossable membrane. The descent narratives are at home in this geography. Being descending from above does not have far to come. Kingdom of Zhang Zhung occupied the western and northwestern reaches of this plateau, in what is now the Ngari region. Its political history is poorly preserved. Its religious culture is preserved, paradoxically, only because the later Tibetan Buddhist establishment found it useful to absorb rather than to erase. The founder of Bonn is named as Tompa Shenrab Miwoch, a figure whose biography in Bonn tradition runs to many volumes, and who is conventionally placed thousands of years before the Buddha. Mainstream historians regard the dating as unverifiable and the figure as semi-legendary. Bonn practitioners regard him as a historical teacher whose biography was preserved in the Zhang Zhung Yingyu, the oral tradition of Zhang Zhung, transmitted master to disciple for more than 2,000 years before being committed to writing. The Zhang Zhung Yingyu is in print. It has been translated into English in part by John Reynolds, an American scholar who studied under Namhai Norbu, and who has published with the Vajra Bookshop in Kathmandu and with Snow Lion Publications. The translations are available to anyone who wants to check them. What the texts describe, in their archaic stratum, is a transmission. First lineage holders in the Bonn account did not learn their cosmology from observation or from human teachers, received it from the lie, from beings of the upper realm, in encounters that took place on specific mountains and at specific times. teachings included the structure of the cosmos, multiple worlds layered above and below the visible world, the names and functions of the inhabitants of each layer, and a method of return. The method of return is the practice. The Bon tradition calls the rainbow body, in which an advanced practitioner at death dissolves the physical body into light and leaves behind only hair and fingernails. Rainbow body is not a metaphor in the Bon tradition. It is a claimed observed phenomenon with named witnesses and named cases, the most recent of which was reported in 1998 in the eastern Tibetan region of Khenpo, Akko. The case was investigated by the American researcher David Steindl-Rast and the Tibetan Lama Chogyal Namkhai Norbu, and the report is in print. Mainstream science has not engaged with the report on the grounds that the evidence is anecdotal. The Bon position is that the evidence is what the evidence is. Eyewitness testimony from named individuals about a named individual gathered shortly after the events. To understand the Bon claim about the rainbow body, one has to understand what the upper realm was said to be in the first place. It was not, in the early texts, a place of pure spirit. It was described as having geography. It had mountains, rivers, palaces, valleys. Tla lived in those palaces and travelled along those rivers. They wore clothing, specific clothing, with specific colours and specific ornaments. They carried specific objects, a particular kind of sword, a particular kind of mirror, a particular kind of cup. In the iconography of Bon, these objects are still depicted, with the same details, on thankas painted in the 21st century. They are not generic religious objects. They are specific items, transmitted across more than 2,000 years of artistic tradition, with remarkably little drift. Compare this with the iconography of the Sumerian Anunnaki, who are also depicted with specific objects. The so-called handbag, the pine cone, the wristwatch-like band, on cylinder seals dating from the 3rd millennium BCE in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection. The objects in the two iconographies are not the same, but the principle is the same. These are not abstract symbols. They are described as items carried by described beings in a described place. The cosmology that holds the two systems together is the layered universe. In Bon, the layers are explicitly enumerated. There are 3 upper realms, 3 middle realms, and 3 lower realms, with a vertical axis connecting them. The axis is sometimes a mountain, sometimes a tree, sometimes a cord. The early kings of Tibet, in the most archaic stratum, travelled along the cord version. Later texts describe the mountain version. Later texts still describe the tree version. The drift is in the metaphor, not in the underlying claim. The vertical axis exists. It is the route of descent and return, and it is anchored at specific physical points on the earth. The mountain that anchors the axis in the Western Bon tradition is Kailash. The mountain that anchors it in the central tradition is Yala Shampo. The mountain that anchors it in the Eastern tradition is one of the peaks of the Amnye Marken range. These mountains are real. Their coordinates are public. Pilgrimages to them have continued without interruption for more than 1,000 years. What the pilgrims walk around in the Bon understanding is not a sacred metaphor. It is the foot of a ladder, whether the ladder is real or whether the belief in the ladder is itself the artifact, is a question the texts cannot answer alone. The texts are precise about what they claim. They claim a route. They claim travellers along it. They claim a moment, identifiable by the reign of a named king, at which the route was severed. The recent archaeology adds to the picture. Beginning in approximately 2004, Chinese archaeological teams working in the upper Sutlej Valley have surveyed the ruined city identified by Bon tradition as Kyunglung Ngulkar. The site sits at an elevation of approximately 4,300 metres, It consists of carved cave dwellings, defensive walls, and the foundations of larger structures, distributed across several kilometres of cliff face. Pottery and the burials so far recovered point to occupation in the first millennium BCE, with possible earlier strata not yet excavated. The site has not been published in a comprehensive monograph in English. Chinese language reports describe a culture that does not fit cleanly into either the Tibetan Buddhist horizon or the prehistoric Central Asian sequence. It is materially distinct. It has its own architecture, its own methodology, and its own apparent writing system. The undeciphered inscriptions of Western Tibet, the so-called Sma script that Bon tradition assigns to the era of the Sky Kings, have been catalogued by the Italian-American researcher John Vincent Bellezza, who has spent more than 3 decades documenting rock art and inscriptions across the upper plateau. Bellezza is not a fringe figure. He has been a research scholar at the Tibet Center of the University of Virginia. His catalogue runs to thousands of images, gathered at sites that almost no other foreign researcher has reached. The inscriptions he records are unlike Tibetan, unlike Sanskrit, unlike Chinese, and unlike the Indus Valley script. They have not been read. They might yet be read, until they are. What the early Bon texts say about a script older than Tibetan remains a testable claim, sitting on rock walls in western Tibet, waiting for a decipherment that has not yet happened. The Tibetan pattern is not isolated. The closest parallel, in terms of specific detail, comes from Japan, from a body of texts called the Takenouchi manuscripts. The Takenouchi documents claim to preserve a record going back tens of thousands of years, transmitted within a single hereditary lineage of the Kosokotai Jingu Shrine in Toyama Prefecture. They were first made public in the 1920s by Takenouchi Kiyomaru, the lineage holder of the time. They describe a series of pre-imperial Japanese sovereigns, the so-called heavenly sovereigns, or Sumera Mikoto of the upper world, who descended to govern the earth and returned along a vertical axis that the texts call the floating bridge of heaven. The floating bridge of heaven is not unique to the Takenouchi tradition. It appears in the 8th century CE Kojiki and the Ninshoki, Japan's 2 oldest surviving chronicles, as the route by which the god Izanagi and the goddess Izanami descended to create the islands of Japan. In the Orthodox Shinto reading, the floating bridge is a poetic image. In the Takenouchi reading, it is a description of a specific transit mechanism used at specific times by specific beings, in a chronology that runs in parallel with the Tibetan descent narratives. The Takenouchi manuscripts are textually disputed. Most of the originals were confiscated and destroyed during the Second World War. The surviving copies have been challenged on philological grounds, and mainstream Japanese historians regard them as forgeries of the late Edo or early Meiji period. Whether they are forgeries or genuine ancient transmissions is a real question, but the issue here is narrower. Takenouchi narrative was already in circulation in the early 20th century. The Dunhuang manuscripts, sealed since approximately the year 1002, were not opened until 1900. No diffusion from East Asian shrine traditions to a sealed Chinese cave is possible in any plausible chronology. The 2 traditions agree on the descent of pre-imperial sovereigns along a vertical axis from an upper realm. They agree independently. The same pattern appears in the Vedic tradition of India, in the descriptions of the descent of Manu and the 7 Saptarishis from the polar region above the earth, anchored at Mount Meru. Mount Meru is, in Indic cosmology, a cosmic mountain at the centre of the universe. In some Indic and Buddhist sources, Mount Meru is identified with Mount Kailash, the same mountain that the Bon tradition holds to be the anchor of the Mu cord. The convergence is striking. 2 distinct traditions on opposite sides of the Himalayas identify the same physical peak as the foot of the same kind of axis, with the same kind of beings descending along it. Conventional explanation is diffusion. The traditions are said to have borrowed from one another over centuries of contact along the trans-Himalayan trade routes. This is a serious explanation, and it accounts for many of the shared elements. What it does not account for is the specific geographical anchor. Diffusion can transmit a story. It can transmit a vocabulary. It can transmit a ritual practice. It is harder for diffusion to transmit a specific coordinate, a particular mountain in a particular range, and to have that coordinate remembered identically by traditions that have, for most of their history, been politically and linguistically hostile to one another. Mount Kailash sits at approximately 31 degrees north latitude and 81 degrees east longitude. It is in the Bon tradition. It is in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It is in the Hindu tradition. It is in the Jain tradition. Coast. And in each of these traditions, it is the same kind of place, the foot of the vertical route between this world and the upper one. 4 religions agreeing on a single coordinate across nearly 3,000 years of doctrinal divergence is not nothing. Sumerian parallel, mediated through the Anunnaki accounts of beings descending from a heavenly realm to particular cities in southern Mesopotamia, is more distant but structurally identical. Beings come down, they teach, they rule for a finite period. Route between their world and ours is then severed or restricted. After the severance, ordinary human history begins. The strongest objection to this entire reading is the one that has to be taken seriously. It is the argument from convergent imagination. Human beings, the argument runs, are wired to look up. The sky is the most universal visual feature of human experience. Stars are the same stars wherever a human stands on the surface of the earth. Mountains are the highest local features in almost every inhabited region. Ropes and cords are the technology by which pre-modern humans climbed to high places and lowered themselves from them. Given these universals, the argument continues. It should not be surprising that cultures in many different places independently arrived at cosmologies in which beings from above descend on cords or trees or mountains to govern the earth and then return. The convergence is not evidence of a shared historical event. It is evidence of a shared imagination operating on shared visual inputs. This is a strong argument. The form of it is unimpeachable. Convergent evolution of myth is a real phenomenon. The Australian Aboriginal dreaming, the Norse Yggdrasil, the Mayan saber tree, the African baobab traditions all share elements of the vertical axis with the Tibetan mucord and the Japanese floating bridge of heaven, and no one seriously argues that all of these traditions descend from a single event. The convergent imagination argument is, on its own ground, correct. What the argument has more difficulty accounting for is the specificity of the physical claims in the most archaic Tibetan stratum. Cord is not generic. It is attached to the crown of the head. It is severed at a particular ritual, at a particular reign, by a particular king named Drygum Tsenpo. The royal burial practice begins at exactly that point in the chronology. The kingdom of Zhang Zhung leaves material remains at a real archaeological site. Pre-Tibetan script exists on real rock walls. None of these specifics is required by a generic vertical axis myth. They are overspecified for that purpose. Question that remains genuinely unresolved is whether the over-specification is the trace of a real event imperfectly remembered, or whether it is the trace of a religious institution that happened to invest more imagination in the details than other comparable institutions did. The honest answer is that the question is currently open. The archaic Bon stratum is what it appears to be. The conventional chronology of the Tibetan plateau has to revise. Kingdom of Zhang Zhung becomes older and more developed than current archaeology allows. Pre-Tibetan script becomes a real writing system that predates the Tibetan alphabet by an unknown margin. The descent of the first kings becomes a question for historians rather than only for mythographers. Mount Kailash becomes a coordinate on which four major religious traditions converge for reasons that have not yet been adequately explained. None of this requires the literal existence of non-human beings descending on cords. It requires only that the texts be read as the early stratum reads them. The Dunhuang Library Cave was sealed in approximately the year 1002. It was opened in 1900. The manuscripts are in the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Bonn tradition is in print. The question is still open. Chamber is in the desert, west of Dunhuang, in the province of Gansu. The cave is numbered 17. The manuscripts are in London and in Paris. The books are available. Giuseppe Tucci was a professor at the University of Rome and the founder of the Italian Institute for the Middle and Far East. Namkai Norbu was a professor at the University of Naples Oriental Institute, and a Bonn tradition lineage holder published their readings of the Tibetan descent narratives, and those readings have not been refuted. What the early kings of Tibet were said to have done, and how they were said to have arrived and departed, and where the cord was said to have been anchored, is still open. The mountain is in western Tibet. Its name is Kailash. It has not been climbed. Pilgrimage route around its base is 52 kilometers long. The library has been open since Wang Yuanlu broke through the wall in 1900. It is still open now.